Welcome to var or not to var? That is the question. Hey, I'm Eric, and this episode is not a cheap knockoff of me reciting Hamlet with computer words. This is actually a very common cause of weird mistakes. So, what am I talking about? I am talking about the concept of when we're calling a procedure, we have parameters to the procedure. We can mark those procedures to be var or not var. And what does that mean? Well, if you look up the documentation, you'll learn that var is by reference. But what does that actually mean? If we go back in ancient computer times, or still today, when we have languages like C, C++, and Pascal for that sake also, but typically this is a concept that people are working with in C, is that you can choose to have a pointer, and a pointer is basically a simple variable that stores an address in memory and say, okay, we're pointing to this specific place in memory, and that is where something is. So instead of when we're calling a procedure that putting the parameters into the stack kind of as a copy of the values, then we're just putting a pointer, so we're putting the address of where to find something. Meaning that if we have an address at some level, we pass that address into a other function we call, we're still manipulating the same address. Now we call it by referencing, so we're referencing this specific memory address, and that is where our thing is. And this gives us some great opportunities, but this also introduces a lot of confusion. And just to make it even more confusing, AL is no longer actually doing as the documentation for AL is saying. But let me show that later in the video. Let's just make sure that we get the base concept and some of the most common mistakes made. I have started a new extension here, and let's say that I create a procedure. We call this proc A, and it takes a parameter integer, integer, and it adds a 1 to the integer. That's all it does. So let's go up here and create something that I could call this great function. This is the, that is computer science to the next level. Let's call it I up here also, just to make it confusing. So if we say I equal 10, and then we call proc A with I, and then after this I is now %1, comma I. So now we can see what happens. So we have I as a function. We call proc A. So we have I as a function. We have I as an integer with a value 10. And we call the proc A with I. Inside here, I is incremented by 1. And then we message what I is. So let's try to deploy this, see what happens. I don't think this is a big surprise, but I is now 10. And that is because when we call into proc A, we called with a copy, so we did not specify var in front of this. So at this point, this I we have here is a copy of whatever we put into the into the parameters here. So when AL is calling proc A, it is creating a copy of I and placing on the stack. And that is the I we're working with here. When the call is done, the stack is popped as it's called, so that is getting removed from call stack, from memory, and we still just have the I that's sitting on this stack frame. Sorry, this didn't mean to get into it. Anyway, so we have the original I here. But if we then say, okay, let's change this function into using var, meaning that now I is by reference. So what we're passing here is not I, but it's the address of I. So this I and this I are suddenly sharing the same address. And if we run this, come on PC, you can do it. I'm going to do a lot of deployments today, so hopefully it's fast. So now I is 11. So that's pretty, transparent. We can see that, okay, now this is the same I, so we're passing it. What's interesting here is that let's do this and say, if I remove var here, I can just pass a constant. But if I have var on this, then the 20 I have here is a compiler constant, so it does not have an address in memory. It doesn't exist on the stack per se. So there's no address. So then we cannot pass it because there's nothing to pass here. There's no value. So this has to be a variable as soon as it's var transferred, because otherwise there's no address. Okay, so that's the basic of it. Now, one of the most common mistakes in all of the world of nav, the world of Dynamics, the world of Business Central is, let's do another example. So let's create a record. Let's just do vendor because we're on the customer list. So let's do vendor just to be clear. So let's find the first vendor. Then let's change proc A now. So now proc A takes a vendor record as parameter. So we'll pass our vendor here, and we don't need a message. So what we're going to do in here now is let's do something about this vendor. So let's change the address to hey, and we'll modify that. There we go. We don't do modified true because that's another video. If you haven't seen that video about how to validate stuff, you should totally subscribe and watch all the other videos, or a couple of them. So now proc A is taking the vendor record and we're modifying it. Okay, so when we're done in proc A, let's take the vendor and change this into I'm Eric. So we have hey, and then we have I'm Eric. We can also do something like this, and then let's do a modify here. So we get a vendor, we call into the function, we pass the vendor, we modify the vendor, then we're done with that, then we modify the vendor again. And let me deploy this without the debugger. Boom, classic error. That it's the same error, but I think this is a place where Microsoft have really struggled to come up how to word this error. So the error message is constantly changing, but the error is all the same. So it's saying the changes to the vendor record cannot be saved because some information on the page is not up to date. Close the page, reopen it, and try again. And then identification, fields and value, number equal to 10,000, page customer has to close. So that is perhaps not necessarily the most helpful the most helpful error message. I think my favorite of them all has been when it says that this vendor has been modified by another user after it was retrieved from the database. Kind of makes sense. So, but let's go back and look what happened here. So we get a vendor. So V is one version of the vendor. That's the record. Then we call our procedure, and we get a copy of the vendor record. So at this point down here, when we are modifying this, then we have not three, two copies of the vendor in memory. So the second copy here is getting modified with hey, and then we're popping the stack, so we are losing this copy of the vendor and we're back to the original copy. So at this point, if we look at this, let's run this again with the debugger actually. That's the breakpoint. So now proc A has done. So the value of vendor 10,000's address to field is hey. But if we look at this, it actually says hey. Wow, maybe I have run some old. That's actually, that was totally not what I expected. But nonetheless, we're getting the error on. Okay, hang on guys, what is going on here? Did I just do something stupid? No, I didn't. If you're all yelling at the screen to tell me what's wrong, then I will hopefully figure this out in just a second. This is blank, so nothing has been saved. I think the debugger totally messed up here. Let's try this again. I go debugger, and I just hit a 5, and now I get an error. That is kind of weird. Anyway, we get the error because at this point we're trying to save the old version. So while between this find and this modify, there were the other modify. So the version on disk is no longer the version we got from our find. It was the version that was modified here, but that is lost from memory. So this one does not match what's in the database. Of course, the solution to this is again simple. We add a varp in front of it, and now it is the same. So that is pretty. We don't need to do this. I don't need to run it. I think you guys get it now. So that is predictable, and all this follows the rules that are stated in the documentation. But let's try something else. So let's do this. Let's create a variable called J and let that be a JSON object. And we could add something, field 1 that has a value. And then let's change our proc A again now to take a J, and that's a JSON object. And let's do j.add field 2 with another value. So we'll call proc A with J, and then let's do this. Let's actually do message format J. So at this point, we have not added a var in front of this. So if all the rules that I have stated so far and the rules that are in the official documentation, then what we would get is a JSON structure with one field. And I think you guys probably guess what is going to happen. We get a JSON structure with 2 fields. But Eric, you're now saying, hey Eric, you didn't put a var in, so, and the documentation clearly states, so what's happening? So what is happening is that where we need to go is actually, we need to go to C# for a second, and we need to look at how C# works, because JSON object is a .NET value. It's not a .NET value, it's a .NET object, and .NET objects are treated differently in calls like this than a primitive, that's a hard word to say this late at night, primitive data type such as an integer or a string. So those kind of and you can also do this with HTTP client and HTTP response and content and all those stuff. Those are always by value. Sorry. Oh, those are always by reference. And I think the reason for this is that it's pretty. In some cases you can have some very weird structures, meaning that you can have objects that points to itself and stuff like that. So creating deep copy of classes for stack calls would be crazy in a lot of cases. So the third rule here. So 3 rules: primitive types, so classic Pascal types, integer and decimal is actually not a classic Pascal type, but that's a different story. Integer, decimal, date, string, code, all those types are copied, and you need to specify var. The same goes for record. So you can say that record is a classic AL type, but all the new types that are backed by .NET based objects does not work this way. Maybe Microsoft is changing, maybe, I don't know, but as you can see on screen right now, this is not necessary. I personally do think that it's important for readability that you might as well add the var to kind of indicate to the reader of the source code that, hey, I know how this works, and I'll help guide you, dear reader, to understand what works and what the intentions are. So that could also produce some gotchas around this. Anyway, let's keep this video under 20 minutes. So that was to var or not to var. Hope you gained some insight. Let me know in the comments below how you treat vars. Actually, you know what? I'm going to totally go over my allotted time of 20 minutes and just going to do one slight detour. This is bonus content. See you later. If you're busy, this is totally bonus content. So let me go into the code unit in the base app that I love to hate, hate to love, love, hate, something. Type helper. This is an awesome code unit. I think there's actually a video on this one somewhere. There's some very nice function called URL encode and URL decode, where there's truly an unholy relationship between parameters and the functions. So here you can see that this kind of looks like, you know, you pass a value, you get something back, and we calculate the value and then we exit it. But these functions are marked as var, meaning that they are both functional in style with returning value, but they're also by reference with var. So this creates some strange ways of dealing with this, because suddenly you have a function that potentially, if you say something, if you have variable a, let's actually try this, since we're into the bonus bonus content anyway. So let's do T1 and T2 are text. So T1 equal, let's do something like this, slash something. So we want a URL encode. Well, that's anyway, that doesn't matter. So we will do T2 equal type helper dot URL encode T1. So at this point, this looks very simple, right? We take T1 and encode that and put it in T2. But this function also puts the encoded version back in T1. So unless you actually, you know, read the source, you might get into trouble, because some functions choose to do this, and this is bad. This is reason enough that I think we should do a clean implementation of this code unit that doesn't belong in base app anyway, that belongs in system application, and get rid of stupidity like this, because this will really, this tricks people, and I have a couple of times fallen into the trap of this, that suddenly you get double. Anyway, so that's the danger with var, that if you just var everything, then you're breaking stuff. Another bonus, man, this video is getting long. Sorry. Bonus content number 2 is, let's say, be aware, and this is not Microsoft, so this is, I think this is Andreas, so probably this is gonna get fixed really quick. So if I create on after encoding, and I'll do T1, T2 here, and then I use the AL code actions to create an event. So AL code actions. Oh, that's David. Sorry, I thought it was Andreas. That's David. So be aware that so I'm getting sidetracked here. So bonus content, deal with it. You see, most events are, if you really want people to have a chance to modify stuff, or to have to change things, then, you know, make sure that your events are actually var transferred, the ones that you want them to change. Maybe you only want them to change T2 in this case, but the default action here, let me undo, redo. Then I go and take the code action again to create the integration. What you just get here is without ROS at all, which is also kind of dangerous. Anyway, that's enough for bonus content. I think we're done for today. So thank you for watching. Stay safe, and I will see you soon in the next video. Take care. Bye.